Welcome to the Pro Social Workers Podcast, the place where social work meets diversity, dialogue, and ethical practice. Here we offer courses that promote viewpoint and political diversity while fostering human connection. And the best part? Our content is completely free to access. For professional social workers and interested others, we provide the option to earn continuing education credits with a simple fee after listening to our episodes. Go to prosocialworkers.com to learn more. Together, we'll explore how to truly put the social back into social work. So tune in, get inspired, and join us on this journey towards a more inclusive and connected future.
This episode is part of a series on social work education and practice that was inspired by a prior live stream panel discussion. In today's episode, 4 social workers discuss their experiences with social work orthodoxy. First, you will hear from the 2020 National Association of Social Workers Social Worker of the Year, Xander Keg. He will describe his experiences with cancellation and censorship. He's a public speaker, family caregiver, social care educator, best-selling author, sought-after corporate workshop presenter, and host of the popular Umbrella Hour podcast. Dr. Nafis Alam will describe how his initial experiences in social work education sparked his interest in viewpoint diversity and how it is central to his research and teaching. He is an award-winning professor. He specializes in non-profit program evaluations and macro practice. His research agenda is guided by his self-determination in sport social work with a secondary focus on viewpoint diversity, including open inquiry and constructive disagreement in higher education. You will also hear from Matt Watson, who will share why this issue is important to him and how he came to work together with Xander to establish Pro Social Workers. Pro Social Workers is dedicated to promoting viewpoint diversity and political diversity in social work practice and education. Matt is a licensed clinical social worker and has provided psychotherapy in a wide variety of settings for over 30 years in 5 different states. He is the president and CEO of Pro Social Workers, an affiliate of the Institute for Liberal Values. Matt and Xander conduct a longer interview with Dr. Tiffany Jones, who faced the wrath of an American institution for challenging the narrow view of gender ideology and refusing to privilege postmodern theories over all others. Dr. Tiffany Jones received her PhD in social work from Howard University. She is a research methodologist with specializations in design and statistics. She also provides consultation internationally and domestically to other researchers and graduate students with their studies. We hope you enjoy these discussions.
Hello and welcome to the Pro Social Workers Podcast. We'd like to do a little bit of an introduction of ourselves. So Xander, you go ahead and go first.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. I joined the NASW in 2010 as soon as I got my acceptance letter to the San Diego State MSW program, and I was a member in good standing for a number of years, from 2010 to 2021, I believe, 2022. And I had a lot of success within the NASW. And what I mean by that is I served for 8 years on the NASW LGBT Issues Committee. 2 of those years I was chair of that committee. I was also awarded in 2018 the NASW Social Worker of the Year for the California chapter. And then in 2020, I was awarded the Social Worker of the Year from the national NASW office. And so, I'd say that was a lot of success that I had within the NASW as far as being involved. And one of the things that I was invited to do was to be an ambassador to a brand new product that rolled out, I think it was in either 2017 or 18, called My NASW, which is a bulletin board for members of NASW to communicate with each other. And I was asked as an ambassador to start threads and respond to threads and to, make people feel like there was something going on, and there were things that they could join in on, conversations they could join in on and start. So my first experience with social work orthodoxy, so to speak, started in the My NASW portal on these thread boards. And so that's actually also where I met Matt. And it was following the election of Donald Trump that some of the political issues, the polarization issues, started to come into the threads. And some of the issues that were raised were that if you are a social worker who's a Republican or a conservative or a Christian, you were deemed incapable of following the code of ethics of the NASW, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to even be a social worker, or at least not one in good standing. And so there was a lot of back and forth, and I don't know if it still holds the record, but at the time, it was fairly new portal, but it was one of the longest threads that had come on, that had been engaged with in the portal. And so I found that a bit disheartening, and eventually I decided that I just didn't want to be part of it anymore. I'm not involved in social media, and it felt like a similar kind of environment to me. And so I left as an ambassador of the My NASW board. But then I was invited to what was called Chats with Mitt. And Mitt was the former president. I'm not sure if it's just previously or previous to previous president of the NASW board. And she would have these wonderful live Facebook chats with social workers out in the field on a variety of topics. And I was invited to be on a chat with Mitt on LGBTQ, I think was the topic focus. And there was myself and another social worker who was also part of the community. I'm a trans man. I believe she was lesbian. And Mitt wanted us to just start out talking about things like, what does the L mean? What does the G mean? And it was really interesting because there was a significant age difference between me and this other social worker. And when it came to Q, I think there was an IA also on the end, if I'm remembering correctly. I said, well, Q probably mostly means queer now, but it used to mean questioning because queer wasn't a word that was widely embraced within the community. I said I is intersex, and that's kind of a newer thing being added on. It has really nothing to do with sexual orientation unless it does, or gender identity unless it does. It's a completely different category, and we often use it in a way that's not really inclusive. We include it as a letter, but we don't include intersex people in our conversations and our community that much. And then with A, I said, well, it used to mean ally, but I think it means something else now. And the other social worker said, yeah, asexual, which, we didn't have much discussion on it, but it was interesting to see kind of the evolution of that. And that was all well and good. And then we got into pronouns. And this is where things started to happen. People were asking questions because it was a live Facebook event, and people were asking about pronouns. And I made a comment that having alternative pronouns is not new, and it's becoming much more common, and that there's also something called neopronouns, which a lot of people weren't familiar with, which are like the names of inanimate objects and animals and things in nature, made up words. And then I referenced that some people have likened their pronoun requests to, I use the pronouns it and its, and itself. And I made a further comment to say that I think that's dehumanizing, and I won't refer to a human being as an it. Instead, I'll use their name. And for some reason, that really upset some people. And the fallout from that was that the Arizona chapter of NASW put out a public statement condemning me, my remarks, saying I had caused harm to the trans community because of my remarks. They had to withdraw, they had to pull that back a little bit, make some changes to it, and resend it out at the request of NASW, the national office. But ultimately, that went far and wide in its original message. Then what happened soon thereafter, I was invited to speak at an NASW New Jersey conference, and they were contacted by, a couple people, not a lot, who had a problem with me speaking. And I was told that they had had issues in the past. They wanted to avoid issues. And so they asked me if I was willing to step away from being a plenary speaker and just pre-record my workshop and have it be available as just a standard workshop. And they didn't say exactly what I had done or said, but they said that the people objected to me as a speaker. So again, it's all very disappointing. And ultimately what I decided to do was I stepped away from the NASW LGBTQ, what became Q Issues Committee. And eventually I just let my membership lapse, and I'm no longer a member of the NASW. And, I felt sad about that. I wish there was a place for people like me who have my kinds of viewpoints, considering that I'm a member professionally of the occupation and I contributed a lot and I got a lot from the NASW. But currently it's not something I feel is a place for me And so I'm remaining outside of it. Let's hear from Dr. Nafis Alam, a social work professor who has their own story to tell.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. My name is Nafis, and my origin story starts back in the first couple days of my master's education back in 2010 at the City University of New York, Hunter College. For orientation, the first assignment that we had to do was to write a reflection paper on Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It was an article of 26 items, a fairly short article, 26 items that denote white privilege. My reflection paper was such that, well, I've reviewed these 26 items, and I don't necessarily see white privilege so much as I see green privilege, socioeconomic status. Many of those points of white privilege, quote unquote, were privileges that were earmarked for people who had a certain amount of wealth. Not to get too much into this, but I grew up pretty well with my parents, and many of those privileges that were shown as white privileges, I've also experienced myself. That was my reflection, saying that, well, I'm questioning whether or not this is really white privilege, and some are, but others, mostly, I found to be green privilege. I got the worst grade that I've ever gotten in my life. It was an F, it was a failing grade. But thankfully, I was allowed to revise and resubmit this assignment. Now, in the comments of that assignment, it wasn't, grammatical errors or spelling errors or anything like that, although I wouldn't have been surprised by that. English is my fourth language after Bengali, Hindi, and Arabic. But it wasn't that. At the real bottom of the page was, you didn't understand the spirit of the assignment. So I was welcome to revise and resubmit this assignment, which I did, except being a social scientist / prankster, I feel like they're essentially synonyms, social scientist / prankster that I am, I wrote the same exact paper, except whatever position I held this time, I held the opposite in that revision. Same number of sentences, same references, same everything. Didn't change any of the spelling or the grammar or anything like that, not that that was an issue for that particular paper anyway. This was back in the day where they had bulletin boards in colleges. I don't think they have many of those anymore. And they wanted to hang my paper up, thumbtack it to the bulletin board. That's when I realized that I was not being assessed based on how I think for myself, rather on whether or not I think according to the orthodoxy, aligning with that orthodoxy. Prior to that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. There was football, there was business, there was Wall Street. There's so many different things, and I was undecided. That was the moment when I was like, I need to be in front of the classroom. I want to be a professor, and I want to be in front of the classroom and be able to do what I'm doing right here, right now, is to show that viewpoint diversity does have a place in higher education, social work education, which is my discipline. So over the next several years, throughout my master's and early on in my doctorate, I essentially I cosplayed as someone that I'm not in order to get the best grades possible. And I've talked about this in the past where my old football coach would always say, you got to learn to play the game before you change the game. And I played the game. I played the game in such a way that wasn't genuine as far as who I am personally, but I could figure out my professors, and I knew what they wanted to see. I knew what they wanted to hear. I knew what they wanted to read, and I gave them exactly that. And then finally, once I was able to achieve my doctorate, and I stood in front of the classroom, this was my opportunity, and it has been my opportunity for almost a decade now, trying to champion free speech, viewpoint diversity, open inquiry, constructive disagreement in social work education, and of course, on a larger scale, higher education in general. So I've got 4 decades of career left. I plan to squeeze everything I can out of it. And I'm hopeful that, once it's time for me to retire and hang it all up, that hopefully I would have moved the needle just a little bit, maybe even more than just a little bit, toward the inclusion of different perspectives and different ideologies in the college classroom. Because I'm sure other students have had similar experiences to mine, and it's important to include all voices, not just orthodoxy voices. So that's my origin story.
That's great. Thanks, Nafis. Thank you, Xander. Great examples, and we've become fast friends through this movement, this effort together. My experience was that I hadn't been a part of NASW for decades, but was invited to rejoin, and so I did in 2017. The summer of 2018 is when Xander and I crossed paths on that message board that he had pioneered. Being on that board was that thread that kind of got my attention. I believe it was titled, Someone with Conservative Values Be a Real Social Worker. And I just watched that thread for a few days. I had never posted before, was just kind of getting oriented to it, if you will. And then I decided to post. And one of the contributors, and this is not the first time that this has been on that board, and it won't be the last, was that if you hold conservative values, the onus is on you to define how that aligns with, how those values align with the NASW Code of Ethics. And so I took some time, I thoughtfully prepared a response and went through the Code of Ethics, each one of the values, and identified how conservative values align with the NASW values. And what ended up happening is there was a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth. Not everybody agreed with me, and I'm totally fine with that. But what ended up happening was that board continued for quite a while, and I got distracted by other things, and a few months later was on vacation when I got a message from a friend who had seen what I had posted on the board, and she was complimentary. And I thought, man, that thing is still alive. And so I went back and read all of the posts, and I did some additional contributions, and that was in October of 2018. In November, the NASW press acquisitions editor reached out to me to see if I might be interested in authoring a book. And I didn't think it to be prudent or wise to author a book on conservative social work as much as I did think it was prudent and wise to do an edited work with multiple contributors on viewpoint and political diversity in social work practice, and the importance of social workers being social workers first. Political work is part of social work. Partisan work is different than political work. And I think what I've noticed is there is a significant amount of partisan work being done among social workers, including the NASW itself, the National Association of Social Workers. Their PAC, their Political Action Committee, obviously leans heavily partisan. I went to a presentation by Angelo McLean. At that time, he was the CEO of NASW. He came to where I lived at the time in Arizona. I did a presentation. I approached him afterwards, let him know about our project, what we're working on. He was very encouraging, and I followed up with an email thanking him for coming to Arizona. And he shared how important it is that we be social workers and not necessarily entirely partisan, highlighting how a Republican senator was co-sponsoring one of NASW encouraged bills. And so there's just been a lot of encouragement by people who put social work first rather than privileging their political ideology or a partisan approach. What ended up happening was we continued to work on this project. We had a number of contributing authors who had willing to author a chapter, but the COVID-19 pandemic happened in 2020. There was a George Floyd murder, and then his associated upheavals, social upheavals, and so forth. And there was the advancement of different race initiatives, including Black Lives Matter and some folks who emphasize critical race theory. The press simply told us, and what other publishers told us, is that in order to be published, we had to have a chapter or a contributor with somebody who would present on critical race theory or essentially critical theory and so forth. And as hard as we tried, we approached many people trying to help to invite them to author a chapter. We very much wanted to include a chapter, but what we found is that when we explained what it is that we were doing, trying to promote viewpoint and political diversity in social work, we would always get a response that they had other priorities, or we literally could get someone to contribute a chapter who was fluent and well-versed and comfortable in authoring a chapter on critical race theory. And so that project didn't happen. But over time, Xander and I, we have worked together since then in doing presentations, and we presented to various NASW chapters. I presented with two others at the national conference in 2022. Presentation came within an hour of the announcement of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade in Washington, D.C., where the conference was at. But every time we presented it, and presented it in the spirit of viewpoint and political diversity, We have been typically well received. It has invited dialogue across differences. It's humanized different perspectives, and it aligns squarely with the NASW Code of Ethics. And that was how Pro-Social Workers was born. And that is what has contributed to us connecting with so many people who are interested in bringing about viewpoint and political diversity in social work. So that's where we're at today.
If you want to hear more about and from Xander, Matt, and Nafis, check out some of their other contributions to ILV panel discussions, Liberal Values Labs, and the Dissidents podcast. As promised, here is the longer discussion with Dr. Tiffany Jones, who describes her experience with social work orthodoxy. Tiffany has also shared her story and insights with ILV partner Free Black Thought.
Hello and welcome to the Pro-Social Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Matthew Watson with Pro-Social Workers, and I'm joined today by Xander Kaag as well as Tiffany Jones, and we'll introduce ourselves. The purpose of the Pro-Social Podcast is to humanize people who are different and dialogue across those differences, and then to stand for viewpoint for ethical principles, all in the spirit of trying to promote viewpoint and political diversity. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been licensed in 5 states, and I'm privileged to work together to promote viewpoint and political diversity. With my colleagues here today, I'll invite them to introduce themselves. Xander, would you like to introduce yourself, and then Tiffany?
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. Hello, everybody. My name is Xander Kaag. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. I'm currently only licensed in 2 states, but at one point in time, I was licensed in 6 states. I live in Florida. I was the California NASW Social Worker of the Year in 2018 and the National NASW Social Worker of the Year in 2020, and was involved for a number of years in the NASW at the national level, specifically with the LGBT committee. And I'm part of Pro-Social with Matt, and I'm just happy that you're here.
Thank you, Xander.
Pass it on to Tiffany.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tiffany Victoria Jones. I am a research methodologist. I am also a social worker. I'm a licensed master social worker, and I am in New Orleans, my hometown.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. We're excited to get to know you and learn a little bit about your experience and your background. We want to emphasize that each of us are affiliated with different organizations, and the viewpoints that we share today are entirely our own and are not necessarily those of our employers or other affiliated organizations. We're excited to have Tiffany with us. She has a vast array of experience, and we've seen her in a number of other podcasts, and we think it's interesting. She has an interesting experience that highlights some of the challenges that come when we as social workers adhere to a viewpoint orthodoxy. And so we want to talk a little bit today, listen to her and talk about her experience and invite her to share and talk a little bit about things that we might learn from that experience, as well as just looking at different viewpoints and how orthodoxy can impact our work as social workers. Tiffany, do you want to share a little bit just about your background and help us get to know you? What was your education like with regards to viewpoint diversity? Was that emphasized at all, or was it primarily just other elements of diversity?
Viewpoint diversity was definitely emphasized at Howard. Definitely. The School of Social Work is accepting of, I'm speaking very generally, very accepting of varying viewpoints and varying backgrounds and cultures. So, and I think that comes from the fact that it is an HBCU, and most of the people who teach there are Black. So we've got that shared connectedness in terms of culture and some traditional beliefs that are held by Black American Hebrew culture.
Okay.
So being accepting of differing views definitely was emphasized at Howard. At Howard, whatever you say you think, whatever you say you believe, you have to support it. As long as you're able to support what you believe, go for it. But where you can't support it, there are challenges. Let's talk about that. You've stated this. Have you considered that? And so it was good because it allowed you to be challenged in your thinking.
Mm-hmm. When you provided support at Howard or anywhere else, did you have to provide empirical support for it, or could you provide non-empirical support? In other words, values or those kinds of things as well?
Values were important because values are affirmed. Howard uses a Black perspective. So differences in values are emphasized. However, because it is academia, we can't just start talking about, oh, I feel this way, I believe that. We have to be able to support what we're saying.
Okay. With some type of a theoretical background, with some type of a theoretical context, with some type of empirical support. Is that right?
Yes, empirical support, logic, facts, something that links the ideas.
Okay.
There is no just talking at Howard. No way.
Right. So logic and reason were your ways to connect with people who had different viewpoints than you. You didn't have to strip yourself of your Christian background, your Christian beliefs. You just had to use facts, logic, and reason as the lane to which you could bridge with people who had maybe different religious beliefs, different theoretical beliefs. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We could still use our religion, but the idea wasn't certainly never to try to make somebody else your religion.
Yeah.
That's for a different space.
Yeah.
Not in academia, but definitely we're allowed to bring our whole selves. So to talk about, oh, leave your values outside the door. No, you bring your whole self to a space.
Okay.
What you don't do is demand or force somebody or compel somebody to accept your way. You bring yourself, present yourself, and if someone else likes it, cool. If they're like, oh, I'm good.
Yeah.
I like the way I think.
Yeah.
Then that's cool too.
Very good.
So then now let's take a pivot, because you graduate from that program, you get your PhD, and then you're hired at a university to go teach. Yes. And then sounds to me like you didn't find the same pursuit of intellectual honesty in that space. You want to tell us a little bit about sort of how things started, and not where they've ended up, but at least, what the experience was like for you in that teaching position.
Sure. So I started off at Clark Atlanta, and then I went on, I ended up getting very sick. I had a terrible arm injury, put me out of work for somewhere around 2 years. I was able to go back. It wasn't until I got to Tulane University a few years ago. So my academic career began in 2013. While at Tulane, I do say the university's name because I've worked at a lot of Southern universities. So I don't want to misrepresent any of those other institutions. It was at Tulane, which is in the Deep South in New Orleans, where things really shifted for me. And I had a totally different experience teaching than I had as a student. I was welcome in this space, generally speaking, as a student. And I can say I was not welcome as an academic at Tulane. Who I am, what I bring to the table, my whole self was not welcome.
So say more about that, describe that.
Sure. Well, just to briefly tell the incident of what happened that led to everything, just to keep it short and sweet, in a class setting, I did not affirm the idea that men give birth. When a student said this, and instead, I didn't openly disagree, which I unequivocally do. But I didn't I did disagree, verbally express disagreement. What I did instead was I asked a question. I said, well, let's talk about this. What is gender? And that question led to a backlash like I've never experienced in my life. The student who brought up the idea of men giving birth, who I asked the question to, what is gender? That student ultimately filed a formal complaint against me. I was accused of sexually harassing her. Her friends launched a revolt to get me fired and get me blackballed from all American universities. And then after that, I was just under an awful lot of scrutiny. I was told at some point that I needed to embrace the new language, and the new language was not using any gendered language. Here's a perfect example. I asked the question, I said, well, how do I refer to my mother? Because my mom, at the time, we were going on a year of her passing away. And I said, well, we're getting ready to honor my mom's 1 year passing. I don't know the way to say that, 1 year anniversary of having passed away. It's my mother. What do I say? And I was told, instead of saying mother, you say the gestational parent.
Wow.
Yeah. And I said, that's absolutely not happening.
Wow.
Absolutely not happening. And in that same conversation, I was told I was only permitted to use postmodernism as a theory to teach.
Wow. Okay.
So it's very much, this is the line of thinking, this is the language
Right.
we're using. You must use it as well.
Interesting. Can you, Xander or Tiffany, could you explain a little bit about what postmodernism is? Just briefly, just kind of succinctly share.
Absolutely.
Tiffany, you wanna take it as a professor? I'm sure you're quite well versed in it. For me, it'd be a lot of opinion about things, I think.
Well, postmodernism is a worldview, it's a perspective that, just in a nutshell, everything you believe is right. And it's right because you make truth. There is no objective reality, there's no objective truth. Truth is whatever you say is true. So as a result, because the student said men give birth, well, now that is true. There's a problem with that, though. The limitation to the theory is that it doesn't account for errors in reasoning, and it doesn't account for contrasting viewpoints. So, for example, the young lady said men give birth. Well, when I turn around and say men do not give birth, these are conflicting ideas. But under the same theory, both ideas are correct. Only in that space, her viewpoint was the one that was accepted.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, that's what's
So
really
that-
interesting to me. It's like if there's no truth, like no meta truth, but when one person says their truth, somehow that their truth becomes the truth, which then violates postmodernism. So
Bingo.
I don't understand how it's not understood that you can't force your truth onto other people.
You know what? And I don't, that's the thing. I think that where there is a line of reasoning or an idea that's being pushed and heavily promoted, and it's under the guise of postmodernism, it suddenly becomes the accepted way of thinking. And if you go against that, then you're violating postmodernism and you're being hateful. I was called so many names, things I never even heard of. And so I absolutely, Xander, there's a contradiction, and there's an inherent embedded contradiction in postmodernism perspective in and of itself. The idea that anything is true ultimately means nothing is.
Yeah. And I could imagine, for example, as a trans man, I could imagine that some people might take a nuanced approach and say a trans man who has retained reproductive capacity is capable of getting pregnant and carrying a baby to term. And then having that baby in the modern, lexicon, that would be, I'd be a trans man who's having a baby. But that's different from just saying men can get pregnant. It's like, well, trans men who are female sexed with a reproductive system that holds babies, right? It's like, do you think that nuance would have been acceptable in that setting?
Ultimately, that's where we did get to. Because initially the students said men give birth, and then said men have uteruses, and then went on to say, well, I'm talking about trans men. And I said, okay, well, what is a trans man? She went to explain. And I asked the question because I wanted to hear her response. And so I heard her response. And so I think from that perspective, I get what's being said, that this person is identifying as a trans man, therefore a trans man gave birth. Or just to say it plainly, a man gave birth. But I pose an objection to that, in that there could be an issue with the labeling. So if a person labels themselves, if I label myself as anything, if I label myself as, I'll just say a giraffe. If I label myself as a giraffe, would someone say, my colleague, the giraffe, is about to teach statistics, bivariate statistics? So I think there's an issue with the labeling, even that idea. And again, I want to say something. That's my viewpoint, that there's something going on with the labeling. There was no room for even that kind of conversation. Because what I say ultimately is, what I end up telling my student is, you're free to believe whatever you like. I'm not here to tell you not to believe what you believe. If you shape your belief around your statement, around whatever core values you have, or whatever constellation of viewpoints you hold, they're yours. And you're more than welcome to express them. Others can challenge and present their ideas, but in no way does a challenging or expression resort to this is what I say and you must believe it. That should never happen. We're all we're free to express ourselves.
So the postmodernism applied as long as it was in the context of deconstruction of of the social norms. It didn't necessarily apply to bridging understanding or to tolerating different viewpoints. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I think that it doesn't. It didn't apply at all to understanding different viewpoints, or even getting pushback, or getting a challenge. It didn't apply to any of that.
So Xander,
Go with it.
Xander, if you were in that classroom as a trans man trying to maybe nuance that a little bit, if you have somebody in there saying that, gender, anything is gender, or, putting forward the postmodern viewpoint of gender, how would you suggest, or how would you have responded if you were a student in that classroom?
Well, I think I would just speak very plainly and say, while I appreciate your attempt to be an advocate for trans men, as a trans man, I take issue with your declaration that men can get pregnant, because I know specifically that you're referring to people like me, except not me exactly, because I don't have those reproductive organs anymore. But if I did, and I have friends who have bore children, looking like me. So I know that this exists, but I think it's, and I think this is one of the intentions of postmodernism, in that deconstruction, or in the attempt to completely discombobulate reality, to make a declarative statement like men get pregnant, and then have such an extreme reaction to wanting to get you fired, and having people gang up on you, which is a bully tactic, is very authoritarian. I think it goes against the grain of what it means to be a social worker. That I would not support whatsoever. And so then now there would be a conflict between that student and myself, and it would be really interesting to see how the administration would deal with an actual trans man saying, I take issue with what you're saying, and quite frankly, I don't need you to be an advocate for me or my community, right? Like, I can speak for myself, let us speak for ourselves, because we're not a monolith, and we don't all agree with that changing of the language, that destabilization act of trying to, it's like, if you're a social worker and you go work on a OBGYN floor, right, and you're at the bedside with patients, it's probably going to be very rare that you're going to have somebody that looks like me on that unit. It might happen once a year, maybe once in a career you might experience it. So who are the majority of people that we're going to be encountering in pregnancy centers and OBGYN clinics, right? Who are we going to be encountering? And so it seems to me like we had the conversation about majority minority, but where I think it comes into play is if we're working in a particular setting with a particular patient or client population, if I was working in a pregnancy center, an OBGYN clinic, if I was told I'm now supposed to go into this setting and tell all of those women who are now just gestational people with uteruses or womb havers, I think most of them would be quite insulted, right? So it's like this theoretical conversation in a classroom before compared to a practical, like you talked about. It's a very practical, field, social work, the applied component of social work in those settings with those populations. I think I'd be laughed out if I started just referring to all the women in those settings as gestational parents or people with wombs or uteruses. And I think that's offensive. Yes. Taking women down to their bodily organs, I find offensive.
Yes, and there's something, Xander, there's something so beautiful. These are the things that I find beautiful in the earth. I find the sexes beautiful. And so to strip away women's ability, it's not an actual stripping away, but the verbal and the ideology, the ideology, presenting an ideology that, you're just a uterus haver, you said a womb haver, a birthing person. What? That's hurtful, because there's something beautiful about being called a woman, The same as there's something beautiful about being called a man. And again, this is just my opinion. It's one of the things I find beautiful in the earth.
Well, we welcome your viewpoints. So you're
Yeah.
Well, you can, I think too often for, a parallel to this would be if as a clinician, we have a particular affinity or we end up with a particular clientele that is all men. Like when I was working at the VA, I worked exclusively with men. And so I would post things on my Facebook back in the day, like 10 years ago about men's mental health. And one of my colleagues, out in the field, not working with me at the VA, would say, I didn't know you became a men's rights activist. Because it's like, because I was, as if that's a bad thing, right? It's like, but the idea is that if you are supporting and championing men's mental health, somehow you're anti-woman, you're sexist, you're misogynist. So in a similar case, we do not have to denigrate men and women, males and females, in order to support, or in the language of affirm trans people. We can simultaneously uphold the biology of male and female while simultaneously supporting, if we are so inclined. I don't think we should force people to accept anything, but if we're so inclined, we can also support the human dignity and the human rights of trans people. We don't have to pick or choose. And I feel like we're pitted against each other. It's like, you can't support me, supposedly, right? You wouldn't be able to be supportive of me, it's said, because you're not using the right language. But I don't require you to use specific language.
correct. Yeah. So as with the NASW Code of Ethics, 4.02 talks about discrimination, and that we should not discriminate based on a variety of things that are differentiated: race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration, or mental or physical ability. Code of Ethics precludes us from, as social workers, from discriminating based upon those things. It's interesting that belief, political belief, religion, those kinds of things seem to have taken a subservient position in your educational experience there, Tiffany. And I would be interested to know, just kind of, if you could maybe finish the story for us, what happened and how did it, and I'd also be interested in how that was justified, or what was the perspective from the institution in proceeding as they did.
Well, what happened ultimately was I had to undergo several trainings. I did undergo several trainings. I had to have my classes observed. I had to meet with a woman who asked me what she wanted to know eventually what is my gender identity. And I'm like, gosh, okay, I'm not going to discuss that. That's, I ended up having to express myself through email and say, I'm not going to discuss that. I'm not having that conversation. But that, I had to, like I said, have my classes.
That if you acknowledge, it seems like a trap. That if you acknowledge gender identity, then you have to be retrained or rehabilitated. You have to have your classes. Well, no, I don't want to mock you or them at all. I just want to say that while having this experience, you had to be re-educated. You had to demonstrate. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but what's the difference between having to be re-educated, be re-supervised in your education, going through somebody who's going to deconstruct gender identity, or make sure that you are adopting the postmodern viewpoint?
There is no difference. And I ended up saying, because I had to do a lot of writing, this is conversion therapy.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
It makes me think of a struggle session under Maoist control.
Well, or just because it's a philosophical belief that there isn't, empirical, logical, rational basis that enables us to dialogue across diversity, that it's essentially coercing you to adopt a certain unempirical viewpoint. It seems like proselytizing. It seems like that we went from And I think there's room in the world for proselytizing. It's just not necessarily in a secular academic setting.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece to this, and I think this is something that was lost on all of them when it comes back, going back to postmodernism perspective for a moment, that's a theory. Theories are ways of explaining phenomena. Okay. They're based on observations and putting variables together to help to understand and explain what we're observing. And so it's interesting. We use observations to explain what we're observing, but it's a way of explaining phenomena. These are not facts. And so the idea of forcing somebody to adapt a specific type of mindset and use only one type of theory. This is a broadband theory, and underneath it falls other theories. The main one that's implicated here is social constructionism.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, which says reality is socially constructed. Gender is constructed. It's socially constructed. There are some theories that counter that. Gender is not socially constructed.
Sure.
But this theory, the thing I like about theories is, with me, when I teach theories, I never teach one theory. I'm just going to teach conflict theory without teaching functionalism. I always teach a counter, because what that does is it allows the students to make their own decision and select a theory that they find that's appropriate. The same with critical race theory. I think it's a fine theory. It does a nice job of explaining some things, not everything. It's not appropriate for everything. It has limitations, like all theories. And that's something that gets completely lost. It's a theory. The postmodernism, a theory. Social constructionism, theories. They all have their limitations.
Right.
So to force somebody to believe in something that is not a fact is really problematic.
Believe and adopt.
Yeah.
It's like, it's one thing to say, in this class today, we're going to read some literature, or we're going to read a case study, and then we're going to apply these 4 lenses to our interpretation of that experience or that story. And so you can see, all the different ways that you can view a situation in all these multiple ways, and trying to make sense of, well, what matches or what fits, or which is going to provide us the avenue to assisting that individual with getting whatever resources they need. Or, right, it's taking it out of the theoretical and back into the applied. And so for them to be reinforcing or forcing you to change your beliefs and adopt an entire mindset that goes against your own, personal way that you believe in your mindset, it doesn't even make sense to me that why do they even have classes that teach different theoretical orientations?
Right. It's really a violation of academic freedom. Professors are permitted to bring their scholarship into the class space, and not just their scholarship, their beliefs. You can't just go out, spout, this is what I believe, and that's it. No, it has to be contextualized around scholarship. However, we are permitted that. And to tell a professor you only are permitted to teach this one theory is a direct violation of academic freedom. And it's stifling, and it does a disservice to the students. The students are not getting the opportunity to really do what academia is supposed to do. The whole point of academia, from its inception until now, is to produce great thinkers. That's the point of academia. But that's been lost. It's been lost in a goal to ultimately indoctrinate students with a way of thinking.
So you are not opposed to the introduction of theory in social work education. Is that correct?
Correct. Postmodernism has a place.
Exactly. You are not opposed to introducing various theories. What I'm hearing you say is that the opposition is imposing theoretical orientation onto students.
Exactly. My thing is, right. Like I said, anytime I teach a theory, I teach its counterpart. Okay. So that students are able to see from both lenses. So Matt, going back to when you asked me what happened afterward, 2 sessions, I believe it was 2 sessions after that one, I had to teach on the difference between sex and gender. I said, oh my gosh. And it was a prescribed syllabus. So I didn't create the topics. So I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm dreading having to teach this. But I did. And again, I presented two theories. One theory is that the two concepts are distinct. Sex is biological, gender is socially constructed. That's one idea. I taught the other. I presented the counter theory that they are, the term gender comes from the term genre, which was used to say, what is your type? What is your kind? What is your genre of sex? That's how it came about. And so in doing that, I presented a paper by a researcher who admitted, his name was Christopher Dummett. He admitted that he made up his theory that sex is socially constructed. Now, to put that into context, he built the theory off of Jean Monnet's theory that gender is socially constructed back in the 60s. Fast forward to the late 90s, Christopher Dummett presents this paper saying sex is socially constructed as well. But then in 2019, he wrote an essay saying he made his whole theory up. It was never tested. I was able to present both ideas.
How'd that go?
It went over terribly. Students were offended. By this point, the chair of the program was sitting in on my class. She had been sitting in on my classes. And when I presented the paper, she's like, oh, this is Christian. This is Christian. She starts waving her phone in the air. Everybody, this is Christian. What? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she's like, this is from a Christian outlet. No, it's not. I didn't know what she was talking about. Apparently, Focus on the Family, who I don't even listen to. Okay? I'm not saying anything negative about Focus on the Family. I'm sure it's wonderful. I don't listen to it. But Focus on the Family, which is a Christian radio station or something, radio program, I believe.
It's a think tank. They generate a lot of research.
Okay. They picked it up. They picked up this article, and because they posted it on their website, oh, you're promoting Christianity. The students were complaining. They were upset. They started crying. Students said that I was promoting transphobia. And I said, what in the world? This is really unbelievable. So I ended up having to get the class under control. I said, let me just be perfectly clear. Number one, I did not know this was on Focus on the Family. I don't even listen to Focus on the Family. But even if I did, number two, you're arguing because it's posted on a Christian platform. So what? Do you have a problem with Christianity? Because you have Christians in your classroom. Number three, why are we ignoring the author of a theory? Forget where it's posted. Forget what the platform is promoting it. Because I'm sure Focus on a Family has some agenda in promoting that.
Sure.
They're irrelevant. Forget them. The focus is on the author who wrote this essay saying, I made up my theory. And I gave the students an example. I said, I'm going to give you an example. What if, and I'm not saying this is true, I'm sure he didn't do this, but I'm giving an example. What if Albert Bandura, the founder of social learning theory, said 30 years later, hey, y'all, sorry, I didn't beat up that Bobo doll. I made the whole entire thing up. If he confessed that, it would be important for us to know that his theory was simply made up. It was never tested. How does that not hold true for this person? And the reason he came out with the essay was because he said that he felt responsible for promoting this theory when people were getting fired from their jobs. Women were not allowed to use the bathrooms in their own spaces. Men were able to go into the women's spaces, and if they were not allowed or if they were kicked out, there would be repercussions in Canada.
Yeah. Saw the impact of it and thought, hey, I need to take responsibility for this, correct it, and so forth. Tiffany,
it didn't go over well.
Yeah. So Tiffany,
even knowing that, they ended up saying, this is transphobic. You've got to go.
Okay. Tiffany, we've got to wrap up here in a minute. Could you just summarize briefly, what impact did that have on you as a social worker, as social work faculty? Could you just kind of help us understand where you're at right now?
Yeah, well, it hurt me deeply. I was devastated. It made me feel as though I did something wrong. There's a polarizing tactic that's been used. Xander, you spoke to this earlier. There's this tactic of separating us, of oh, well, if you don't affirm me, if you don't celebrate me, you hate me. And that, for somebody to have to sit and think about, oh my gosh, could this be true? I don't hate anybody.
Yeah.
I have no hatred for anyone. In my religion, I'm a born again believer. I am taught to love people and love and truth. You don't just go with everything. Love doesn't mean accepting everything.
Sure.
But I'm taught to love people and to give the truth in love and to be beautiful. That's
Yeah.
what I'm taught. So here I was just really taking this onto my own character. But I had to be reminded of truth, that it's a polarizing tactic. It's a marketing tactic, in fact. And to really be able to see truth and see it for what it was. So where I am now, I was pretty disenchanted, I will say that, because I find the social work core values to be so beautiful.
Yeah.
Love our profession's core values. But I did end up being kind of resentful and feeling as though I'm not welcome as a social worker. But then I had to say, you know what? I've been a voice my whole life. I guess that's my little role in life. God has given me a voice, and I've been that person. Okay, so here I am, and I've taken it on to myself to say, I'm going to be the person to really speak on this and dispel these untruths.
You're going to be a social worker to the polarizing. You're going to be a social worker to those who are different than you. You're going to be a social worker to stand in the breach between acknowledging and allowing for postmodernism and those who do not necessarily want to espouse postmodernism.
Absolutely, allowing for postmodernism and positivism.
Bridging between the two. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Xander, anything else that you'd like to ask or go over with Tiffany before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to say I really appreciate hearing more of your story. And I just want to offer from one trans person that I appreciate that you stand on your convictions and your principles, and that you, to a certain extent, you didn't let the bullies win. They pushed you out of a job, but they didn't break you, right? The tactic of demoralizing did not work. And so I'm happy to hear that. And I hope that you find other avenues to share your wisdom and your knowledge, with other social work students or other kinds of students very soon, because you have a true gift of being able, as you said, to be able to explain things in ways that people can understand. And that's really, it's helpful, especially with such a complex subject like statistics and research. Those are difficult things for people to grasp. And so being able to make those easily understandable is a true gift.
Exactly.
Excuse me.
Welcome.
Well, and just recognizing that you are standing for something, you are pro-social work. You are standing for social work. I'm not hearing you say that you took an anti-stance. You were intending to be provocative by asking a question, but sometimes we do have to ask provocative questions that invite thought, that invite us to reason a little bit, to understand different perspectives. And I certainly appreciate what you shared tonight, and appreciate you being a pro-social worker. We will post this podcast and others at prosocialworkers.com, where social workers can go. The content is always free. You only pay for continuing education, but you are a really great example of being a pro-social worker. And I'd like to just give you an opportunity to end with the last thought here. Tiffany, what does it mean to you to be pro-social?
Wow, pro-social. My first thought that comes to mind is to be for people. To be for people, to work with people, and to do your best when working with people. Everybody doesn't always mesh well, but do your best when working with people, and to uplift each other. We're all different. And like I said earlier, that's what makes, what a beautiful world. What if there were 8 billion Tiffany's? That would be boring. First of all, I talk way too much, so that there'd be no listening, right? It's pro-social to me is about just being for each other, standing for each other, with each other, chastising, correcting each other, but loving each other, telling each other the truth, and being for each other.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany, for coming and sharing your perspective. Thank you for standing in the breach and doing the work of a pro-social worker. And thank you for being for people and for being for diversity. So thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Pro Social Workers Podcast. We're grateful to our guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for being part of this journey. If you'd like to earn continuing education credits, don't forget to visit our website at prosocialworkers.com, where you can register, pay a fee, complete a course evaluation, and take a quick quiz. We look forward to having you with us next time as we continue to explore how we can put the social back into social work.